Salem, Indiana, was the kind of town that people often overlooked. A small, unassuming place with a population that hadn't changed much in decades. The town was known for its old brick buildings, quaint shops, and a single traffic light that blinked idly at the town's only major intersection. But beneath its sleepy exterior, Salem harbored a dark past, whispered about in hushed tones by those who still remembered the old stories. Most people brushed off the tales as nothing more than local folklore, stories to scare children and entertain tourists. But there were some who believed, and they knew to avoid the old cemetery, especially on Halloween night. Jake Williams was not one of those people. A natural leader with a fascination for all things paranormal, Jake had convinced his friends that spending Halloween night in the old cemetery would be the perfect way to end their senior year. To him, it was just another adventure, another story to tell. The group of teenagers had been friends since grade school, their bond strengthened by years of shared experiences in their quiet town. Halloween was their favorite holiday, and they always tried to outdo themselves with spooky activities. This year, Jake was determined to top them all. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jake had said, his brown eyes gleaming with excitement as he pitched the idea to his friends. "Just think about it, spending the night in the most haunted place in town. We'll bring snacks, tell ghost stories, and maybe even catch a glimpse of something supernatural. How many people can say they've done that?" Emily Thompson, Jake's girlfriend, rolled her eyes but smiled at his enthusiasm. She wasn't as into the supernatural as Jake, but she loved his adventurous spirit. "I don't know, Jake. That place gives me the creeps," she said, brushing a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. "But I guess if we're all together, it'll be okay." Matt Harrison, the group's resident prankster, was immediately on board. "Hell yeah, I'm in. I've got some ideas for pranks that'll scare the pants off you guys. It's gonna be epic." His mischievous grin hinted at the trouble he was already planning. Sarah Collins, the quiet, bookish one of the group, hesitated. She had always been fascinated by the occult, but something about this idea made her uneasy. She had recently come across an old book in the town's library, filled with cryptic warnings about the cemetery and the witches who were said to have been buried there. The book claimed that on Halloween night, the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest, allowing spirits to cross over. But she kept her concerns to herself, not wanting to be seen as the killjoy. Kevin Parker, the newest member of the group, was eager to fit in. He had moved to Salem just a few months earlier and had quickly fallen in with Jake and the others. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the idea of hanging out in a cemetery on Halloween sounded like a good time. "I'm down," Kevin said, shrugging. "What's the worst that could happen?" With everyone on board, the plan was set. They agreed to meet at Jake's house on Halloween night and head to the cemetery together. In the days leading up to it, they gathered supplies: flashlights, sleeping bags, snacks, and a few cans of soda. Matt insisted on bringing a bottle of whiskey, just to keep warm, he said with a wink. They also packed candles and matches, adding to the eerie ambiance they were aiming for. As Halloween night approached, the excitement grew. The town was decorated with jack-o'-lanterns, skeletons, and cobwebs, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. The group met at Jake's house as planned, piling into his old pickup truck. The mood was light as they joked and laughed, teasing each other about who would be the first to scream once they were in the cemetery. The drive to the cemetery took them down winding roads lined with trees that loomed like silent sentinels in the darkness. The moon hung full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As they neared the cemetery, the jokes started to taper off, replaced by an unspoken tension that none of them wanted to acknowledge. They arrived at the old iron gates of the cemetery just after 11 p.m. The gates were rusted and creaked ominously as Jake pushed them open. Beyond the gates, the cemetery stretched out in front of them, rows of ancient tombstones jutting out of the earth like broken teeth. A dense fog had begun to roll in, swirling around the graves and obscuring the ground beneath them. Jake led the way, holding a flashlight in one hand and Emily's hand in the other. They followed a narrow, winding path through the cemetery, the fog thickening around them with every step. The sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the eerie silence of the cemetery, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. They found a small clearing near the center of the cemetery and set up their makeshift camp. Matt immediately set to work lighting the candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the tombstones. They spread out their blankets and opened the snacks, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "All right, who's got the first story?" Jake asked, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. He pulled out a bag of chips and leaned back against a gravestone, his bravado returning now that they were settled. "I've got one," Matt said with a grin, launching into a tale about a haunted house on the edge of town. The others listened, their laughter forced as they tried to ignore the creeping chill in the air. Sarah sat quietly, her eyes darting around the cemetery, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. As the night wore on, the stories became darker and the laughter more strained. Midnight was approaching, and with it came a feeling of dread that none of them could shake. Sarah glanced at her watch, noting the time with a sinking feeling in her stomach. In the back of her mind, the warnings from her book echoed, but she pushed them aside, not wanting to spoil the night for everyone else. They were here for an adventure, and that's exactly what they were going to get. Little did they know the true terror was about to begin. The old cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The thick fog had settled in, wrapping around the tombstones like a shroud, and the temperature seemed to drop with each passing minute. The teenagers huddled closer together, their earlier bravado slowly giving way to an unspoken unease. The flickering candlelight cast long dancing shadows across their faces, amplifying the tension that had been building since they arrived. Jake glanced at his watch, the face illuminated by the faint glow of his flashlight. 5 minutes to midnight, he announced, trying to keep his tone light. "Guess we'd better wrap up the stories before the witching hour hits. Or we could just see if any real ghosts show up," Matt joked, but his usual cocky grin was absent. He shifted uncomfortably on his blanket, his eyes darting around the cemetery as if he expected something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Emily, sitting next to Jake, squeezed his hand a little tighter. "This place feels different now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind through the trees. "Like something's watching us." Sarah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since they arrived, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should go," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "It's almost midnight, and I don't know. I've read things about this place." Kevin, who had been trying to stay calm, let out a nervous laugh. "Come on, guys, we're just psyching ourselves out. It's just an old cemetery. Nothing's gonna happen." But even as he said the words, he didn't quite believe them. The fog seemed to grow denser, swirling around their feet and obscuring the ground beneath them. The air grew colder, and a strange, oppressive stillness settled over the cemetery. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, distant cars, the occasional bark of a dog, had faded into silence. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake forced a grin, trying to maintain the atmosphere of fun. "Let's do one more story. Then we can call it a night if you're all too scared," he teased, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Before anyone could respond, the clock on the nearby church tower struck midnight. The deep, resonant chimes echoed through the cemetery, each toll of the bell sending a shiver down their spines. As the final chime faded into the night, a low rumble began to reverberate through the ground beneath them. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but then the earth began to tremble more violently. The snacks and flashlights scattered across their blanket started to rattle and bounce, and the flickering candles were snuffed out as the ground shifted beneath them. "What the hell is that?" Kevin yelled, scrambling to his feet as the rumbling grew louder, more insistent. Jake stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Everyone stay calm. It's just an earthquake or something," he shouted, but his voice betrayed his fear. Emily clung to him, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here, Jake. Now!" Suddenly, the ground around them began to crack, and a sickening noise filled the air, the sound of splintering wood and crumbling stone. The graves surrounding them started to open, the earth splitting apart as if something below was pushing its way to the surface. The first skeletal hand broke through the dirt, its bony fingers curling around the edge of the grave, and then another, and another. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, backing away from the nearest grave. Her worst fears were coming true, and she knew there was no way they could stop it. "We have to go. We have to go right now." But it was too late. The skeletal hands reached out, grasping at the air, clawing their way out of the earth with unnatural speed. The teenagers froze in horror as the skeletal figures began to rise, their empty eye sockets locked onto the living, their bony jaws hanging open in a silent scream. Jake snapped out of his shock first, yanking Emily away from the advancing skeletons. "Run! Run for the gate!" he shouted, his voice breaking with panic. The group bolted, abandoning their supplies and sprinting through the fog-shrouded cemetery. But the thick mist made it nearly impossible to see, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. The skeletal figures emerged fully from their graves, their movements jerky and unnatural as they pursued the terrified teens. Matt, who had been lagging behind, let out a scream as a skeletal hand grabbed his ankle, yanking him to the ground. He kicked wildly, trying to free himself, but the grip was too strong. "Jake, help me!" he cried out, his voice filled with desperation. Jake turned back, his heart lurching as he saw Matt being dragged toward an open grave. Without thinking, he rushed over, grabbing Matt's arm and pulling with all his strength. But the skeletal hand only tightened its grip, pulling Matt closer to the dark pit. "Matt, hang on!" Jake shouted, but even as he said it, he knew it was hopeless. The skeletal figures were relentless, their strength inhuman. With a final, desperate tug, Matt was pulled into the grave, his screams abruptly cut off as the earth closed over him. Emily screamed, her hands covering her mouth as she stumbled back. Oh God, this can't be happening." Kevin grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the gate. "We have to keep moving. We have to get out of here." The remaining three raced through the cemetery, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But the fog was thicker than ever, swirling around them, disorienting them. The skeletal figures seemed to be everywhere, rising from the graves, reaching out with bony fingers. As they neared the gate, Sarah suddenly tripped, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. Jake skidded to a stop, turning back to help her up, but before he could reach her, another skeletal figure emerged from the ground, its hand closing around her ankle. "Sarah! Kevin, no!" Jake shouted, but he could only watch in horror as Sarah and Kevin were dragged back, their fingers clawing at the dirt in a desperate attempt to escape. Jake stood frozen, his mind unable to process the nightmare unfolding around him. Only Emily's frantic tugging on his arm snapped him out of his daze. "Jake, please, we have to go," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. With one last look at the spot where Sarah had disappeared, Jake turned and ran, dragging Emily with him. The gate was just ahead, but the skeletal figures were closing in, their empty eye sockets burning with an unnatural hunger. Detective Thomas Grayson had seen his fair share of strange cases in his 20 years on the force, but nothing had ever unsettled him quite like the disappearances tied to the old cemetery on the outskirts of Salem. Over the years, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Every few decades, on Halloween night, people would vanish without a trace. The cases were always closed with unsatisfying explanations, runaways, accidents, or just the kind of misfortune that small-town police departments were ill-equipped to handle. But Grayson had never been convinced. This year, the familiar tension settled in his gut as Halloween approached. He had spent the better part of the month reviewing old case files, staring at the grainy black and white photos of the missing. The faces haunted him, young, full of life, and then suddenly gone. The more he dug, the more he found. Reports of strange lights in the cemetery, unexplained noises, and locals whispering about curses and witches. It all sounded like superstition, but Grayson had learned not to dismiss anything out of hand. The truth had a way of hiding in the most unlikely places. As dusk fell on Halloween night, Grayson found himself driving toward the cemetery. He told himself it was just routine, a final sweep to ease his mind, but he knew better. Something had been pulling him toward that place for weeks. Maybe it was the fact that no one had gone missing in years, leaving the townspeople to believe that the curse, if there ever was one, had ended. Or maybe it was the uneasy feeling that this quiet was only the calm before a storm. He parked his car a few yards from the cemetery gates, his headlights cutting through the thickening fog. The old iron gates loomed ahead, rusted and worn, their once imposing presence now just a relic of the past. Grayson hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over his flashlight. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave the ghosts of Salem alone. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something terrible, and he needed to be there when it did. With a sigh, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at his skin, and he pulled his coat tighter around him as he approached the gates. The cemetery was silent, save for the crunch of gravel under his boots. As he passed through the gates, the fog seemed to close in around him, muffling the world outside. The tombstones stood like silent sentinels, their inscriptions worn down by time, the names of the dead barely visible. Grayson moved cautiously through the cemetery, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the fog. He felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere itself was waiting, holding its breath. He knew these grounds well. He'd been here many times before, investigating disappearances and following up on rumors. But tonight felt different, more oppressive, more dangerous. As he ventured deeper into the cemetery, he heard something faint in the distance, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the ground. He paused, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. The earth was moving. His heart began to pound as he quickened his pace, following the noise. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a living thing, and the air grew colder with every step. He reached the heart of the cemetery where the graves were oldest, their stones cracked and leaning. And then he saw them, 5 figures, huddled together in the center of a small clearing. Grayson's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the teens. He had seen them around town, laughing and carefree, just kids enjoying their last year of high school. But now, they were anything but carefree. The panic on their faces was unmistakable, their eyes wide with terror as they tried to fend off something Grayson couldn't see. He moved closer, his instincts telling him to call out, but something held him back. The ground beneath the teens was shifting, the earth cracking open as skeletal hands began to emerge. Grayson's stomach turned as he watched the scene unfold, a nightmare playing out before his eyes. One of the teens, a boy with dark hair, Jake, Grayson recalled, was shouting orders, trying to lead his friends to safety. But it was chaos. The fog was so thick that it obscured everything beyond a few feet, and the skeletal hands were relentless, grasping at the teens' ankles, dragging them down. Grayson's training kicked in, and he drew his gun, aiming at the bony figures emerging from the ground. He fired off a shot, but the bullet passed harmlessly through the skeletal hand of the nearest figure, disappearing into the mist. His heart raced as he realized that he was dealing with something far beyond his comprehension. The teens were screaming now, their voices raw with terror. Grayson watched in horror as one of them, a girl with long dark hair, was pulled to the ground, her fingers clawing at the earth in a desperate attempt to escape. But the skeletons were too strong. With a final, sickening pull, she was dragged beneath the surface, her scream abruptly cut off. "No!" Grayson shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The ground sealed itself as if it had never been disturbed, leaving no trace of the girl who had just vanished. He turned his attention to the others, but they too were being overwhelmed. The fog swirled around him, disorienting him, and the skeletal hands seemed to be everywhere. Another teen was pulled under, his terrified face disappearing into the earth as the ground closed over him. Grayson fired again and again, but it was useless. He felt helpless, watching as the last 2 teens, Jake and his girlfriend Emily, struggled to escape. But the fog was too thick, the cemetery a labyrinth of graves and shadows. "Run! Get out of here!" Grayson shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. He watched in horror as Jake was pulled down, leaving Emily alone, her face a mask of pure terror. Grayson's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward Emily, determined to save at least one of them. But just as he reached her, a skeletal hand shot out from the ground, wrapping around her ankle and pulling her down. She screamed, her eyes locking onto Grayson's as she was dragged beneath the earth, her voice cutting off as the ground swallowed her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the cemetery fell silent. Grayson stood alone, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. The fog began to lift, revealing the cemetery in its eerie stillness. The graves were undisturbed, the earth sealed as if nothing had happened. But Grayson knew better. He had seen it with his own eyes. He stumbled back, dropping to his knees at the spot where Emily had vanished. He began to dig with his hands, desperately clawing at the earth, but it was no use. The ground was solid, unyielding, as if it had never been disturbed. The teens were gone, swallowed by the cemetery, and there was nothing he could do to bring them back. The first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the cemetery. Grayson sat back on his heels, his hands trembling as he stared at the undisturbed earth. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. Nothing that defied explanation so completely. As he slowly rose to his feet, his eyes caught sight of something in the distance, newly carved tombstones, standing side by side in a row. He approached them cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The names of the missing teens were etched into the stones, along with their birth and death dates. But it was the faces that chilled him to the bone. Each tombstone bore a carving of the teens' faces, their expressions frozen in terror. Grayson stumbled back, his mind racing. He needed to tell someone, to report what had happened, but who would believe him? The town would brush it off as another Halloween tragedy, a group of kids who had gone too far and paid the price. But Grayson knew the truth. He had seen the evil that lurked in the cemetery, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it claimed more victims. With a heavy heart, Grayson turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away from the cemetery, the fog began to lift completely, revealing the town of Salem, bathed in the soft light of morning. But for Grayson, the nightmare was far from over. He could still hear the screams of the teens, echoing in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay hidden in the heart of Salem. Detective Thomas Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the dimly lit computer screen, his eyes bloodshot and weary. It had been days since that night in the cemetery, but the images of what he'd witnessed were burned into his mind, replaying over and over like a broken film reel. The faces of the teenagers haunted him, especially Emily's wide, terrified eyes as she was dragged beneath the earth. He had barely slept, his mind consumed by the need to understand what had happened and how he had failed to save them. In the solitude of his small office, Grayson sifted through the town's archives, pulling up every piece of information he could find about the old cemetery, the witches, and the curse that had long been dismissed as local legend. He pored over ancient maps, faded newspaper clippings, and yellowed court records, piecing together a puzzle that had eluded everyone for centuries. What he discovered chilled him to the core. Salem, Indiana, had been founded on blood and betrayal. The original settlers, fearful of the dark power they believed lurked in the woods, had accused a group of women of witchcraft, blaming them for the town's misfortunes. The women, innocent but powerless against the hysteria, were dragged to the cemetery and executed in secret, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. Before they died, they cursed the land, vowing to return on All Hallows' Eve to exact their revenge. The curse had been written off as superstition, a fairy tale to scare children, but Grayson now knew it was real. The witches had risen, not as vengeful spirits, but as something far worse, twisted, malevolent forces that fed on the souls of the living. They had claimed their victims that night, as they had done so many times before, and they would continue to do so until someone found a way to stop them. Grayson's search led him to the occult book Sarah had brought to the cemetery that night. It had been found near the gate, discarded in the chaos, and the police had taken it as evidence. Grayson had fought to get his hands on it, knowing it held the key to the curse. Now, as he leafed through its brittle pages, he found what he was looking for. A passage detailing a ritual that could have protected the teens, a way to seal the witches' spirits back in their graves. But the ritual required something they didn't have. the blood of the innocent and the guilt of the damned. The witch's curse could only be broken by someone willing to sacrifice their own soul, to take the place of those who had been wrongfully killed so many years ago. Grayson stared at the words, his heart heavy with the weight of what he now knew. The teenagers had been doomed the moment they set foot in that cemetery. They were the innocent ones, lured by the curse to fulfill a fate that had been set in motion centuries before. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Grayson looked up to see his partner, Detective Laura, standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of concern and exhaustion. "Tom, you need to take a break," she said softly, her voice tinged with worry. "You've been at this for days. You're not going to find anything more." But Grayson shook his head, his eyes returning to the book. "I can't, Laura. There's something here, something we missed. I have to figure it out." She sighed and walked into the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done everything you can. You were there, you saw what happened, but no one could have stopped it. Whatever those things were, they're beyond our understanding." Grayson closed the book and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "But I was so close. I should have done more. I should have saved them." "You did everything you could," Laura insisted. "No one else would have even believed it. But you're just one man, Tom. You can't fight something like this on your own." He knew she was right, but the guilt gnawed at him. What if they come back? What if more kids go missing next Halloween? We can't just leave it like this. Laura's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Then we'll be ready. We'll warn the town. We'll make sure no one goes near that place again. And we'll keep looking for a way to stop it. Together." Grayson nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The curse was ancient, powerful, and rooted in the very soil of Salem. He had seen the faces of the missing teens carved into those tombstones, their terror immortalized in stone. The witches were far from finished, and the town was still in danger. But what could they do? The answer lay in the ritual, in the sacrifice it demanded. He knew what it meant, what it would take to end the curse once and for all. But was he willing to pay that price? To give up everything, even his soul, to save the town and the lives of others? The thought weighed heavily on him, a choice he wasn't ready to make. As Laura left him to his thoughts, Grayson returned to the book, his mind racing. He read the ritual again, tracing the ancient symbols with his finger, committing every detail to memory. There was still time, still a chance to prepare. He would keep searching, keep fighting, but he knew deep down that it would come to this in the end. With a sigh, he closed the book and placed it on the desk. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but the cemetery was always waiting. The thought of it filled him with dread, but also with resolve. Grayson stood, reaching for his coat. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He would continue his work day after day until he found a way to stop the curse. The town of Salem might not believe in witches or curses, but Grayson did. And as long as he was alive, he would protect it, no matter the cost. As he left his office, locking the door behind him, the fog began to creep into the streets outside. The old cemetery lay in darkness, silent and still, but Grayson knew better. The witches were watching, waiting for their next opportunity. He could feel their presence, a cold shadow at the edge of his mind, but he would not back down. Not now, not ever. The night was far from over, and as Grayson walked into the fog, he knew one thing for certain. He would face whatever came next. The witches had claimed their victims, but the battle wasn't finished. Not yet.